collection. Kew has one of the largest collections of cinchona at Kew. And that was paired with Naturalis in Leiden, which has an equally large collection, but we do have a little bit more of wild collected barks from South America. There's around 2,000 items at Kew, around 1,000 herbarium specimens, which are the pressed dried plants, and around 1,000 economic botany items, which are the objects. The economic botany collection is a collection of uses of plants, so things like materials, foods, fuels, and medicines. Medicines is about a quarter of the collection, and within the collection, the largest genus by far is cinchona, which shows how important it must have been in history of medicine. Around 50% of the collection, though, belongs to the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, or used to. It came to Kew in 1983, and much of this is at Howard's. So when I first started looking at the collections, it really was originally to ascertain how Kew influenced the story of cinchona, but it became clear actually that they were less influential within the economic botany items, and that most of the collection was John Eliot Howard's. And who was this person? Why was he so influential? So that is why my PhD went down to studying his work. So cinchona and quinine and why they're important. First of all, though, we must understand the disease malaria. It's a significant global disease, but in Britain and much of Western Europe, we've forgotten that it affected life here. It occurred in Britain until the early 20th century, and you can see this map on the right, which shows deaths in England between 1840 and 1910, around the time when it started to be eradicated here. And you can see it's particularly found around marshy lowland areas like Kent and Essex, where mosquitoes breed. And it is mosquitoes that are part of the trouble, as shown on the left. Malaria is a blood-borne parasitic disease, but it's spread between humans and mosquitoes. It's spread between humans by mosquitoes. And malaria is signified by cycles of fever and chills, as shown in this cartoon on the right. Very distinct 24, 36, 48-hour fever cycles. It weakens the body and it usually ends in death. It depends on the variety and how quickly it can kill you. So tropical variants are usually more swift and fatal, whereas the European varieties tended to make you weak enough to be killed by other causes. So it was a problem very much at home in Britain, where I'm talking from, but also in the tropics, where it became a significant challenge to European governments attempting to claim land for colonies. How significant was malaria, though? Some claim it's killed more people than any other disease, and it was a challenge throughout Europe and the world. And it's also important to note here that it still continues to be a major killer today in the tropical areas of Africa, Asia, and South America, where it particularly targets the young and elderly, and nearly 6% of all deaths in under 19-year-olds are caused by malaria. So I've described the disease, but what about the cure? So for 350 years, the only effective treatment known to Europeans came from the bark of the cinchona tree, which is shown here on the left. So this is a tree that grows from around or beginning at 1,000 meters high in Andean cloud forests from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru and Bolivia. The tree is very variable in how it appears, which led to centuries of botanical confusion. And interestingly, it is not known if it originated as a cure for fevers before Spanish colonization, because it's believed that the severe human forms of malaria arrived in South America in the bodies of the Spanish and the enslaved Africans they brought with them. However, it is likely that the indigenous medicinal botanical knowledge, it's likely that indigenous botanical knowledge led to the cure. And so by 1600, it was heard of by the Spanish in Lima, Peru. And by 1650s, it was being imported into Europe. Before this, there was no known effective cure to Europeans, and it cannot be stressed enough how significant the bark was to be. However, there were some initial difficulties because bark pieces were being imported en masse in leather packages like the one in the middle. This leather package is called a seron. But little was known about the tree's botany, where it came from and how to identify. It was just pieces of bark. So when it was arriving, was it good quality? It seemed to be very variable in efficacy, and there are many records of adulteration being made because it was such a valuable commodity. And there was worry about quality and quantity of the bark and the supply, and worries were circulating about over-harvesting that were reaching Europe. So by 1820, quinine, the active compound alkaloid in cinchona, was isolated by French chemists Pierre-Joseph Pelletier and Joseph Carventu, which meant that the active compound, the bit that worked, could be isolated, dosages could be measured, and different species of cinchona could have their barks assessed for which was the strongest, most effective, effectively, and which could be targeted for potential mass cultivation. So the story of cinchona, though, is tied up in studies of empire and colonization, as well as mass cultivation, because medicinal development beyond its uses as a simple cure came in 1854 when it was discovered that it also acted as an effective prophylactic. At this point, quinine became even more important in controlling health within tropical colonies, and mortality statistics before and after the introduction of its prophylactic use show really startling results. Instead of the majority of Europeans dying, which was happening previously, the majority were now surviving. And that means that quinine was one of the tools that aided the scramble for Africa. Because of this, interest in its cultivation intensified, and botanical trips were undertaken to South America to take seeds and trees from the Andes, often without permission or only with the permission of the Spanish ruling class, but not locals or indigenous peoples in the Andes. And it was eventually first cultivated by the Dutch in Indonesia around 1850 and the British in India after 1861. But the variability that I mentioned before about how the tree looks also reached into its chemistry. And it meant that cultivation was quite difficult at first. So the Dutch, for example, even though they were the first to get trees to cultivate in 1850s, unfortunately, the species they chose had very little quinine in it. So success could only come from understanding which species and varieties of cinchona contained the most alkaloids like quinine. And the answer to these questions would come from the quinologists. So what is quinology? So quinology is a 19th century subdiscipline of pharmacognosy, which is a study of plant drugs, but it's specialized in cinchona identification and later in quinine analysis. As you guess, the clue is in the name. It's related to the name quinine, which in turn was taken from the common name for the bark in most European countries, which was quina or quina. And this was in turn taken from the Quechua indigenous name from the Andes for the cinchona tree, which means bark. And the bark was known as quinquina, or bark of barks. Now, cinchona botany is very challenging. It's a species, as I've said before, is very variable in looks, and it can appear very different even between plants grown from the same batch if they've been put in different locations. And this is likely an adaptation to extreme environments, but also explains the hundreds of cinchona species described by quinologists such as Howard. And recent genetic analysis shows there are actually only 23. So it's incredibly difficult to tell cinchona species by eye alone, and explains why this discipline developed and why it was so specific. So quinology really emerged because successful identification of valuable, medicinally effective and economically valuable bark was really difficult, and you needed specialist skills. And these included these four I've put here, which is the visual, the microscopic of barks, like the picture on the left, the botanical identification, and very importantly, the ability to assess its chemistry or its chemical composition. So the development of the discipline So the cinchona tree, as we know, grew in Spanish colonies and it was a valuable commodity. But people knew very little about it. So there were expeditions, but one particular expedition in 1777 was by the Spanish botanist Jose Pavon and Hipólito Ruiz. Ruiz is shown here on the left. And they led a significant decade-long Spanish royal expedition to Peru and Chile to study the flora of the New World. And a key focus of that trip was to gain a deeper understanding of cinchona, gathering one of the largest and most significant surviving collections of the time. Please remember this collection because I'm going to mention it later. And their work led to their publication of their first monographic botanical study on cinchona in 1792 called the Quinología. As mentioned on the second picture there, Pelletier and Caventou then developed the analytical tools to extract and use quinine. And then after this period, the increasing importance of quinine in the discipline led to further publications on quinology using those kind of terminologies. So I've included examples here, such as in the middle, the French chemist Auguste Delandre, who wrote a book called the Quinologie, and then British quinologist John Eliot Howard, who wrote the Nueva Quinology of Pavon in 1862, and then from 1869 to 76, the Quinology of the East Indian Plantations, which was an analysis of the British cultivation projects. These examples I used to show how the discipline of quinology combined earlier botanical approaches, but had a later emphasis on quinine. So evidence of the emergence of quinology in Europe can be seen by very simple analysis of Google Ngrams, which analyzes book contents. I mean, it's not an exact science, but it does show general trends. So I've got two examples here. The one at the top shows Spanish texts which dominate the early 19th century from the point of Ruiz and Pavon's quinology in 1792 based on their expedition. But political instability and all sorts, it kind of peters off, which I'll explain later. Below has an analysis of English texts, which show that alongside the development of the alkaloid industry and the emergence of quinology as a discipline, English texts and actually European texts started to dominate in the second half of the century, particularly around Howard's publications. But what both these show is that quinology was mainly a 19th century discipline, emerging in force with chemical advances and eventually dying down in the early 1900s for various reasons, but ultimately because plantations had established very good stocks and those were the trees that were going to be cultivated. And then ultimately because antimalarials removed, the invention of synthetic antimalarials removed the focus away from cinchona. There was at least 20 key textbooks solely on this subject, published by both botanists and quinologists throughout the 19th century. And at the heart of the discussion of the quinology was the chronology of cinchona bark types, as expected. And these are represented by beautiful plates, often full colour, detailing the bark morphology, the microscopical assessment, connection to herbarium specimens and therefore species, and importantly, chemical analysis. So who were the quinologists? Well, the role of quinologists was a relatively rare one. Clement Markham, who was the person responsible for sourcing Andean cinchona trees for the British Indian plantations back in 1860-ish, complained at the lack of available quinologists to go to India to oversee the cultivation and ensure that mass chemical production was viable. Speaking of the role, he said, "In truth, the number of men who are capable of filling it is so exceedingly small that the choice is narrowed, and I've had made diligent inquiries almost to one man. There are several learned quinologists in Europe, some like Monsieur Delandre in extreme old age, or others such as Dr. Phoebus, Guibor, Waddell, Mr. Howard, Hanbury, Calzimmer and Co. are not in a position to accept an offer of this kind." So that was in 1866. Now, these names cover France, Germany, and Britain, predominantly, because that reflects the 3 countries most heavily involved in industrial alkaloid production. All of these persons mentioned had medical or pharmaceutical backgrounds, many of the manufacturers, rather than from a purely botanical background, as you might expect. So, for example, most species expertise would really come from botanists at Kew Gardens, but these gentlemen were not that. So this is quite interesting because industry is often at the forefront of technological advance, and it seems that quinology was no exception. And these quinologists were not, as Markham said, in a position to accept an offer of this kind, because most of them were running lucrative quinine extraction businesses and would likely have seen Indian manufacture as competition. And one key figure highlighted here is British quinologist John Eliot Howard, who I'm now going to turn to. So, John Eliot Howard was born in Essex in 1807 to a strong Quaker family. He was the son of Luke Howard, who set up a large, successful pharmaceutical manufacturer as a family business, but who was most known for his work on weather. And he's called the father of meteorology, and in a seminal paper gave in 1803, gave the name of clouds that we still use today, including cirrus, cumulonimbus, etc. So John Eliot Howard came from a strongly scientific background, and the family clearly embraced scientific pursuits, and young John Eliot, no doubt inspired by his father, threw himself into botanical and chemical studies and joined the family business in 1823, aged 16, or around 16. He learnt quinine extraction under Joseph Jewell, who was a partner in the company and one of the first people to start quinine extraction after the French. And Jewell wrote a biography of his life and times in rhyme, and is well worth the history for anybody interested in pharmacy history. The chemical knowledge that John Eliot Howard learned alongside his father and Jewell, combined with extensive trademark collecting, led him to become one of Europe's leading quinologists. But a little bit about his personal life and his other works, as he wasn't only interested in chemistry. So he married Maria Crewdston in 1830, shown on the left, who was a member of another notable Quaker family. He lived with her first in Kendal in the Lake District, but eventually they settled down in Tottenham, not far from the family factory, in a house they named Lordsmead, which you can see in the central picture there. Sadly, the house doesn't exist anymore because it's all been built over, but its location is roughly at the top of Lordsmead Road in Tottenham, N17 postcode. And it has been marked by an erroneous green plaque on the right there, which says that Howard discovered the anti-malarial use of quinine, but I've shown you that that had already happened. But he was significant in the story of cinchona, so it probably needs to be updated, that plaque, at some point. Maria, his wife, wrote a detailed biography of their life together and his works after he died. And it's a really colourful biography. And so if you're interested in reading it, it is available online via the Brethren archives, but you can get hard copies at the British Library and at Kew Gardens. And the one we have was kindly donated by one of Howard's descendants, Bridget Evans, and her husband, Alan. So why I'm starting to go into his private life is because it will come through in his work later, but Howard's life wasn't all about quinology. He was a devoutly spiritual man. And after the Howard family controversially left the Quakers in the 1830s, they joined a nonconformist Christian group known as the Plymouth Brethren. And Howard then set up a church, which he led in 1839, called the Brook Street Chapel, which is the picture at the top. And this still exists today and is still a Brethren chapel, which you can see in the bottom right photo. You can see it, it's just off Bruce Grove, just 20 minutes away from Tottenham Hale Station. And although it's rather encroached upon now by surrounding buildings, many of the original features still exist, including Howard's congregational memorandum, which is on the wall by the entrance, and you can see the top of that at the bottom of my slide there. Yeah, so as I said, I'm highlighting this part of his life because he was equally at home in a pulpit as he was in a laboratory. And through extensive publishing of books on both topics, he established himself as an authority in science and religion. and often tried to harmonise both of these, though it did give him some trouble with species naming. Both of these areas show Howard's passion for seeking truth at the heart of the matter, whether it be botany or theology. So moving on to his factory and work life. Howard's and Sons were a pharmaceutical factory based in Stratford, and as mentioned, the company originated with Luke Howard, along with William Allen, who was a famous Quaker and one of the men who eventually established the Pharmaceutical Society. Now, they established it in Ilford in Essex, but Allen had the dispensing side and Luke Howard was producing the medicines. But they split amicably around 1806, and Luke Howard took his half of the business and upscaled it to a factory size in Stratford. And this is an image of the factory, or part of the factory. And the building on the right with the two chimneys is the quinine department, where John Eliot Howard learnt his trade and used his researches to take the company to be one of the largest quinine suppliers in Europe, at points employing 200 workers, processing over a ton of bark every day, and by the 1880s making the equivalent of tens of £millions in quinine sales alone. If you note the water there, the canal, here is a map of the larger footprint of the factory and the canals in front of it. It's just along Stratford High Street. I mean, none of this exists anymore. It's completely changed and built up, including over the canals. But these canals were what was important for the location. There's a lot of factories in this area, and it was all about transport, straight from the Thames. So for Howard's and Sons, these canals took the tons of plant material, particularly cinchona, straight from Thames trading houses straight into the factory, where it would be boiled up for producing quinine. However, not all of the cinchona bark was boiled up, because John Eliot Howard kept some samples to build a collection for identification, and his studies of these at the factory are what started his career. So here's a picture of the laboratory at Howard's and Sons. This is sadly a bit later, because there are no pictures of the contemporary laboratory from Howard's time, but this is around 1914. And I'm just going to describe the factory through quotes of visitors. So one visitor described it as a well-appointed laboratory in which we find every possible appliance for analysing samples. This little chamber gives us at once the key to the secret of the continuous growth in eminence and importance of Howard's and Sons, founded by two men, Luke and John Eliot Howard, of high scientific attainments. They were among the first of our chemical manufacturers who recognised the value of conducting a scientific manufacture on scientific principles, and the scale upon which their business is now carried on, and position that their productions occupy in the markets of the world, are standing proofs of the truth of the doctrine that theory and practice must always go hand in hand in manufactures. What was this theory and practice? One of these was attention to quality control, and this was established by knowing their materials. The visitor goes on to explain, and I quote, "We commenced our inspection of Messrs. Howard's works with an examination of an interesting series of barks, consisting of typical specimens of every year's importation from 1821 to the present time. They're all labelled with name, locality, and percentage of alkaloids, and form a complete history of the British trade bark for the last 39 years. And it is this collection of trade barks, started a bit before Howard started, but must have been established by Joule or Luke Howard, but which John Eliot Howard built up, dipping into the packages delivered up those canals to the factory, and these are what built the foundation of his knowledge." So this is a photo of that set of barks mentioned in the quote, or it's the cabinet in which they were contained. It was a physical database of sample barks, both from trade and through networks of correspondence from which Howard circulated and swapped around barks from across Europe and South America. So this was a cabinet, and which was like a database, and inside the drawers, I'll show you a picture of the drawer. Inside the drawer were neatly organised jars containing bark samples ordered by country, species, and with an assessment of their chemical analyses. There are around 292 specimens in this cabinet alone, but that wasn't the entirety of his collection. There were many, many more hundreds of barks, which is only known through lists that are kept in the business archives at the London Metropolitan Archives. But sadly, due to their collection vastness, when they were offered round after his death, and as the company started to be shut in the 1950s, lots of people turned them down, and I don't know what happened to them, but they were likely destroyed, burnt, or thrown away, or turned into quinine. However, the RPS took this cabinet and a few more barks, as did Kew. And when the Royal Pharmaceutical Society, should say before I start saying RPS, took the cabinet as well some barks, and Kew took some barks. But when the Royal Pharmaceutical Society stopped teaching pharmacognosy, because that's why they took the barks in, to teach pharmacists how to identify the drugs they were making. When they stopped teaching that, as the era of synthetic drugs came along, the collections were decommissioned, and eventually the Pharmaceutical Society's collections of materia medica that were used once for education ended up at Kew in 1983, and that's how we've ended up with them. In 2002, the Society also sent the archives belonging to the cinchona barks because they decided they should be together. And there is the materials that I based my PhD on. So here's an example of a close-up of his bark. You can see the label in the middle, which shows chemical analyses and connecting it to trade names and species names. Howard collected his barks and linked them with chemical extraction and labeled them, and that's what was in the cabinet. A turning point. So as a young man, he was building up his collections, really getting to grips with chemical analysis and with these trade barks, and starting to understand the species as much as he could from little bits of barks coming in. A pretty hard job, if you ask me. I never learned it, despite looking at it for 4 years. So something else needed to happen. And a turning point in Howard's scientific career came relatively late in life, after he gathered 2 decades of experience in industry and collecting. In 1851, age 44, he had by this point 9 children and was unfortunately in poor health, he hurt his knee and had to stay a lot in hydropathic establishments to recover. But despite that, it was an important year, because it was the year of the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations at Crystal Palace, one of the first World's Fairs, which had exhibitions of culture and industry that were very popular from the 19th century. The Great Exhibition was vast. It showed 100,000 objects to 6 million people, and it was a significant event. And here it was a chance for the company, or Howard and Sons, and John Eliot Howard, to display knowledge in the chemical sections, where they displayed 16 trade barks and their chemical analyses. It drew admiration from experts in pharmacy, including in the pages of the Pharmaceutical Journal, and it won a prize medal. Howard then donated the collection to the Pharmaceutical Society, and this exhibition signified a change for Howard, because it was a lifetime of expertise was now displayed at the Great Exhibition, and winning the prizes signalled his role as an expert. And this notoriety gained within the niche world of cinchona science, he began to be consulted and visited by others in need of his expertise, such as Clements Markham, who I mentioned earlier as the person who oversaw taking cinchona from South America to Indian plantations. He mentioned before he went away on his trip that he went to Tottenham to consult with Mr. Howard, the great quinine manufacturer. Howard's success also gained him access to the sacred spaces of the British Museum. Paired with Jonathan Pereira, who was a professor of materia medica at the College of the Pharmaceutical Society, they examined the extensive cinchona bark collections they had in 1853. Now, remember earlier I asked you to note the Spanish expedition collections of Ruiz and Pavon. This is where they come in again. So due to Ruiz dying in around the late 1810s, early 1820s, civil war, political instability, and probably due to the being short of funds, Pavon sold parts of the collection, the expedition collection across Europe, kind of secretly. And part of this cinchona collection eventually ended up at the British Museum. And as Mark mentioned before, we did some work with Madrid to kind of reconnect the connections from Kew and at Madrid. And it's a really interesting story about how somebody sold these collections. I remember giving the talk in Madrid about this, and people standing up in the aisles getting really mad about it. But I'm not going to go into that too much. You can look up the paper if you really want to. So in the British Museum, looking at those collections, which very fortunately for Howard ended up there, they examined them and they wanted to see how these original field collected barks related to trade barks, because then they could work out which species had the most quinine. Sadly, Pereira died the same year, and Howard on his own went on to publish an account of the barks in a book called The Examination of Pavon's Collection of Peruvian Barks contained in the British Museum. Very creative, very normal for Victorian era book titles. However, it was during this project that Howard says, and I quote, "The subject was left in an incomplete and therefore unsatisfactory state. And I could not help surmising that there must remain at Madrid further results of the labours of the Spanish botanist, which would throw light on the many questions still left in obscurity." And he was right. On making inquiries, Howard found and bought in 1858 a further series of barks from Pavon, an original unpublished manuscript. So Pavon was dead by this point, but he was able to buy some of the barks and the manuscript from someone else that he'd sold. And remarkably, this manuscript, which is shown in the image on the left, still survives rather incongruously in the Howard and Sons Business Archives of the London Metropolitan Archives in Farringdon. It's there because Howard bought it. And he sets down to study these and produces his first colour book in 1862, The Illustrations of the Nueva Quinología of Pavon. Here's an image of one of the plates from the inside. It was a success and it was beautifully made. It was full colour and it's ginormous. It's 50 centimetres tall. It's not a field guide. It's something that people would consult in hallowed libraries. It described nearly 40 species and has beautiful colour plates, such as one on the left by Walter Hood Fitch and microscopical analyses by Tuff and West. And it was sold at £5, which is equivalent to £330. So it wasn't a cheap book. The tome further signalled his role as a key expert in cinchona studies and his movement from tradesperson to trusted scientific gentleman. Howard's book could not have come at a more timely point because it published just as the British Indian plantations were established, and Howard then positioned himself as a key consultant for those in the plantations on what they should grow. And they were sent copies for free by the British Indian government. And he also personally sent 50 copies to institutes and persons of note around Europe, signalling and securing his role as a key quinologist. So there's just a little interlude here, because it's such a remarkable coincidence. But Howard's Nueva Quinología, just before it's published, was read at the Linnaean Society on the 1st of July, 1858, at a special meeting, and the very same occasion that Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin's joint papers were first read on natural selection. And it's interesting because Darwin and Howard were direct contemporaries. They were both born and died just a year apart. Both were interested in botanical variation and relationships, and both built glass houses in the garden of their homes for horticultural experimentation. Howard was slightly ahead of his contemporary, constructing his glass house in 1859, whereas Darwin did his in 1863. They took two different paths, however. Where Darwin travelled and took a broad view of species study, looking at many different types of animals and plants, Howard became very niche in his focus, and this resulted in very different philosophies. Darwin mentions Howard's work in his archives, and we know that he read Howard's Nueva Quinología because he notes unusual botanical similarities between cinchona and primroses, which he was very interested in. Darwin, however, gave Howard some intellectual trouble, albeit unknowingly, because I can't find evidence they ever met or spoke. But his work challenged Howard's ideas as a godly man, that species were created perfectly by God and were therefore fixed. Howard wrote, and I quote, I have no doubt that the principle of natural selection, as illustrated by Darwin, fills up a most important part of the general economy of the world, but I'm very far from thinking that it will bear the stress attempted to be laid upon it. Basically because of cinchona, he says. He also refers to whatever may have been the history of the past, there can be no question of the absolute permanence of all forms of cinchona which meet our view in the well-balanced present. It's interesting to observe the exact way in every minute feature of the barks gathered by Pavon nearly a century ago are reproduced exactly in those brought from the same districts. So that was his argument against natural selection. Howard's grappling with cinchona was a really difficult one because he'd chosen a notoriously badly behaved genus in which it was just an unfortunate stroke of luck for him. So he really had to get to grips with this difficult species understanding. And how would he do that? How did he attempt to overcome the tricksy botanical issues of cinchona? Well, he started to grow it for himself in those specially built glass houses. This image on the left shows one of Howard's homegrown cinchona trees, which he cultivated in his garden in Tottenham from 1859. Howard had seen the future of cinchona, and he realised it lay in the British Indian plantations and understood that to remain a trusted expert, he needed to grapple with species cultivation tips to remain relevant. The backdrop of this left-hand image gives a view of the glasshouse and how it looked. And he grew around 21 or at least 21 varieties. He pressed these for herbarium samples, and there's an example of that on the bottom right. And these are now at Kew and in the Royal College of Physicians Herbarium. But he didn't chemically analyze them. Presumably, they were too precious, and they also took some years to mature, and he had to really hurry up with his knowledge production on just growing them, essentially. And he gave an important talk just on cultivation and published some papers on it. How he obtained his seeds were from contacts in South America from his networks, and as well as some saplings gifted from Markham from on the way to India and on the way to the Indian plantations. Here you can see a plan of his house in these two maps. The house is at the top, and the red arrows show the location of the glass houses. The map on the left shows Howard as he lived there, and you can see the little structures at the bottom of his garden. And the later map, which is from 1895, so it's after his death, it just clarifies that they were indeed glass houses and that they remained for quite a while. If you overlay the maps using a tool by the National Museum Scotland, you can see in this image that you can see Lordsmead Road and how it's been overbuilt with housing. But if you see down near the bottom that you can visit and stand amongst the ghost of cinchona trees and the glass houses where they roughly stood in the front of about 25 to numbers 25 to 30, which I did and took a photo. Yeah, it's worth a visit if you're in the area. So we're moving finally on to Howard's influence. Because decades of laboratory work meant that he became a prolific publisher, particularly through the Pharmaceutical Journal. And this graph shows his articles and books. The blue ones are his scientific articles, his brown ones are his religious. You can see he started publishing long before science on religion. And later on in life, the little donut rings show where he started to combine the science and the religion, but this just shows how prolific he was, and it was his publishing that was making sure that his voice was being heard all the time. No doubt Howard was highly influential in part of cinchona history, as evidenced by his consultation above and beyond Kew in matters of species. In a survey of government records dealing with Indian cinchona plantations in 1863 to 66, Howard is cited 152 times compared to Kew at just 8 times, and the names of its directors at 15 times. There is also evidence in the Kew archives of Howard being sent herbarium specimens, first for naming before being filed at Kew. For example, Clements Markham, as he collected stuff in South America to take to India, wrote to Kew and said, "I think it's important that the species of Cinchona condiminia should be in the herbarium queue as soon as Mr. Howard has examined and compared them so as to satisfy me of the identity of the species, and then I will make arrangements for sending them to you. So this shows that Howard had climbed up from factory lad to preeminent cinchona botanist, valued above and beyond Kew's knowledge. However, many botanical species he suggested are not accepted now, which isn't entirely his fault, as we know that genetic work is needed. But what he did bring to the botany of cinchona and what seems to have made him successful was his chemical background, which resulted in categorizing species by high potency varieties. This suggests an alternative pharmaceutical-based taxonomy, and this knowledge was important and valuable in advising varieties to grow in India. It's not an incorrect categorization in practical ways, it just doesn't fit into any purely botanical terms, but it did seem to work to some extent. But not always, because his botany was criticised. And here in 1883, a purebred botanist, Henry Trimman, who was based in a Sri Lankan plantation, complained in a letter to Kew's assistant director, "I see that old Howard has broken out in a new place, and one does not like to say hard things in print about the old boy, but I wish somebody would stop him writing about the botany of cinchona. His greenhouses, his specimens, his barks, I fear have completely muddled him. I've not seen his last paper at the Linnaean Society, only a reprint, but it's utterly absurd." It seems that Howard's knowledge was eventually overcome by those gaining experience within cinchona plantations after 2 decades of work, and his pharmacy-led botany was eventually ousted by practicalities in the field that relied on knowledge beyond just the chemical. Howard was also recognised as influencing the chemical production in India too, but not positively. While Howard was recognised as a key advisor to the plantation growing project and was supportive of cultivation itself, he disagreed with Indian mass quinine manufacture, preferring European expertise in extraction, which of course included his own family business. And this did raise some eyebrows about his neutrality and self-interest. George King, who was a superintendent of one Indian plantation, wrote to Kew's director, Joseph Dalton Hooker, in 1882, stating, "Howard, of course, has a finger in the pie and has written a memorandum hostile to the manufacture in India. When will the India office learn to think of Howard as a money-grabbing Quaker and not a distinguished philanthropist? He wants to squash our factory here, of course, but the India office can't seem to see the real reason." So it's clear then that Howard was taking on a role of government consultant, no matter how philanthropically advertised, also allowed him to influence the plantations and promote his own business interests. However, he had worked hard in helping unpick cinchona botany and chemistry and was regarded as a trusted consultant by those in government. He was also highly revered in the world of pharmacy, where he donated barks for training of pharmacists to the Pharmaceutical Society throughout his career. This was generous, but also, no doubt, advertised his business as a key quinine supplier to newly fledged pharmacists, so he was an incredibly canny businessman as well. In reflection of his work, he was made a Fellow of the Linnaean Society in 1857, a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1874, and in 1883 was awarded the Hanbury Medal from the Pharmaceutical Society for high excellence in the promotion of original research in the natural history and chemistry of drugs, and he was the second person to be awarded this. Howard died shortly after the Hanbury Medal, following a brief illness on the 22nd of November, 1883, so just a few days ago from this talk date. It was shortly before his 76th birthday and only just a few days after preaching at his chapel, so he was spiritual to the end. Only one of his 9 children had predeceased him, and he had seen the growth of his family's business to one of the largest European pharmaceutical manufacturers. The reach of his achievements was reflected in the description of his funeral cortege, which included thousands of mourners. Over 30 carriages contained respective members of religious and scientific circles, including the president of the Pharmaceutical Society, the Lord Mayor, Sir Robert Fowler, the Lord Justice of Appeal and Quaker Sir Edward Fry, and obituaries described that the best man in Tottenham has gone from us, and a wreath of cinchona leaves were laid on his coffin as a fitting emblem of the service he has rendered to humanity. that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you to all of my colleagues at various institutes, and thank you to Felix and Mark and Techne for funding this research. I would like to open up for questions if you have any.
So thank you very much, Kim. So invite people to, if possible, try using the under actions. You'll find the raise hand symbol, and we'll see if that works. And if it doesn't, then just unmute yourself and speak. But I'll kick off while people are thinking. So there's always a question, about these people in the past. Were the reputations overblown? And what does their legacy look like? And he described this tremendous funeral cortege, which is just this was someone with very wide connections and widely recognized as kind of active in society. But you've spent probably more time with Howard than anyone since his immediate family, 100 years ago. What's your impression of him as a man?
Yes, so I do go into that more in my thesis because he does seem to have been, influenced by family, philanthropy, and religion, and feeling that he had to do well in the world or do benefit the world, being, the Quaker background of making sure that whatever you did was of benefit to humanity. And so he clearly did follow that, but it doesn't mean he wasn't a canny businessman, and they were very smart at what they did in promoting the business. And yeah, I think he was incredibly influential in his very niche world, but was little heard of beyond that. But yeah, within Cinchona and in the plantations, he was a well-known person. I think, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, no, exactly. That's great. A great overall assessment. People are also welcome to turn their video on as well.
I think if anybody is interested in reading about him, his wife's biography, of course, that's very biased. It's very interesting. I was very fortunate that this kind of material existed for looking at this kind of person, because often you don't have that kind of material. So the archives were very rich, and biographies and people writing about him were pretty colourful, actually. I mean, I've only pulled out a couple of colourful quotes. I mean, he was obviously a bit Marmite, as they call it. People liked him or they hated him.
Thank you, Kim. Edward.
Hi there. Hi, Kim. Thank you. That was a really nice lecture. Very interesting. I'm glad I didn't have to read all 100,000 words. There was something you mentioned that caught my attention early on, and that was related to the naming, I think, of species. I mean, naming is a very contentious thing at all times, but you mentioned that Howard's religious background influenced how he named things, if I got that correct. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, it wasn't so much about how he named things, but how he viewed species, because he really believed God had created species, everything, at the point of creation, and that was it. Nothing changed. And so he just had to figure out the species, and that's why he ended up supporting the many, many different names. But what we actually do know is cinchona is so variable that even within species, it can look so different. It does look like lots of species, but it's actually only one species. So he was really having to grapple with all these different types that were coming from him, just feeling that they were all different species. But he was able to recognize within those, which was successful, is that if you have a big species, so if you have a species of cinchona, and it's very variable in the way it looks and in the way it produces chemistry, if you've made it into 5 different types of, I mean, he was just recognizing varieties, even though he was calling them species sometimes. That was the one that was being targeted. One that was full of quinine was being targeted for cultivation. So his naming was useful in some ways. It just wasn't necessarily the way botanists would agree with it. But it shows, and I also think it shows the value of and the influence that medical professions generally had on botany throughout time, not just this point as well.
Thank you. You made the point well that there are different ways of looking at those species, and his was a very practical one that played into what was important at the time. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you have any problem raising your hand, just put your name in the chat bar, as Maria has done, and I will then call on you to speak. Maria, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. So thank you very much. That was very interesting. And I have many questions, but I won't hoard you. So my main question is about his network. So he was receiving these samples from all over the world, and were his correspondents mostly Anglo English speaking scientists, or was he also connected to botanists from like local botanists where he was getting his samples from?
You know, I skipped that slide because I was scared of running out of time. But I can show you the slide now. If I looked at his correspondence in his archives, so there's probably more than this, but this is what's recorded. This is examples of his networks. These numbers relate to how many people he was talking to within each country. So you can see that he was building up networks between people in Germany, France, Austria, Spain, Netherlands, and also in South America. And these were people who were scientists, pharmacists, doctors, collectors, tradespeople, and these were a few of his collaborators. So yeah, obviously needed to not skip that slide because it was something that was of interest to you.
Yes, thank you so much.
That reminds me of a rather charming letter from Wendell in Paris saying, "But I wrote you 2 days ago and haven't heard back yet. And are you well?" Reminding us of the amazing efficiency of postal services back in the 19th century. Felix, I see your hand up.
We can't hear you, Felix. You're muted. It better not be a difficult question, Felix. Oh, we can't.
I may be able to unmute you from yeah, let's try.
I think I'm unmuted now.
You are.
Okay, thanks very much. Kim, that was great. I think there were some photographs that are not in the thesis, so that was great. I wanted to ask you about those criticisms. They were so stinging, so harsh from, I think, a fairly obscure figure called Trimman, and then from George King, who I think became director of the Calcutta Botanic Garden, so quite a significant figure. And I wondered if you could comment on the criticisms, where they're coming from. You know, they're obviously irritated by this older figure in Britain and not on the ground and so on and out of touch. But in other ways, I think the comparison with Darwin is really interesting. And that's in the thesis. And it's really, really interesting because I wonder if Howard is actually more representative of Victorian science or pharmaceutical science than Darwin is. You know, he's more a representative figure. And it's very tempting to say he's become old-fashioned in his science. Could you comment on that? Did the science go out of date in his lifetime, or was that later? And if it went out of date, what was replacing it? Or was it more about, you know, physical location and where those other scientists were, and or those other botanists were? What was it that made them so annoyed with him, or so critical of his science?
Well, I think that essentially it is a rivalry of disciplines is one part of it. So botanists versus pharmacists, people working in science versus people working in industry. And yes, I do think that there was a great amount of change within science in all sorts of fields during this period of time. And it was hard. I mean, it's hard for us to keep up nowadays in many, you know, industries. So I can with the internet. So I can imagine it's very difficult at that period of time as well. So keeping up, and as he aged, yeah, he was quite old by the time he was being criticized. Well, he was being criticized throughout, but I mean, those are particularly interesting, juicy letters. And it did show that as the plantations developed and expertise was able to develop elsewhere, they were able to challenge him on it more. I think that's
it's interesting that as Q is in a way getting closer in general to sort of commercial exploitation or to agriculture, it's interesting that Howard is being criticized apparently for his proximity to commerce. So I think it's strangely contradictory, but I really appreciate the comparison, with Darwin and the greenhouses and their status and their relationship to religion. I think it's really, really interesting, and well worth sort of developing, really, publishing on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix and Mark, for guiding me through it all. Yeah, it's all very complicated to discuss about, the history of science and the changes at this point. So hopefully I've just captured the flavour of it somewhat.
Certainly have.
So I happen to notice that in the audience we have Mark Honigsbaum, whose book Fever Trail is the great classic and the starting point for any research in this field. Available from all good bookshops. It is a cracking read, and actually one of the prompts for the idea of his PhD, the seeds of it, started in 2002 with some money from the Wellcome Trust to recatalogue our cinchona collections, revealed how big they were. Was a feeling that quite a lot of work been done in India by Lucy Veal later on, quite a lot of work in South America by Mark, who tells a very complicated story very clearly, and there was perhaps something in the middle that needed further investigation at the London end. But Mark, do you have any thoughts on this? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yes, I remember Mark Nesbitt, you put that book in my hands the first day and went, go read this first before you do anything else.
Just to say, I enjoyed your talk greatly, Kim. I learned a lot from it. It was particularly fascinating to learn that it was almost an exact contemporary of Darwin's, and that they both presented these seminal lectures for each of them at the same meeting. I wondered partly, I was going to ask in relation to that, whether there's this idea that you sometimes hear, from old school botanists, that a compound as miraculous as quinine couldn't have just been an accident of nature. Do you think that that was something that, as a religious person, played into Howard's antipathy or difficulty accepting theory of natural selection?
It was a really good question. I think one of the yes is my answer.
Okay.
But I think one of the things that I didn't really clarify, and just because there's so many points I could make, is actually when he writes about cinchona and science, he actually rarely talks about religious stuff. He tries to keep them very separate. It's only later on that he starts to combine them. There's only a couple of hints where he just gets a bit frustrated about it. It's more that once you do see him commenting about it, it throws light on why he's had such a problem for a long time. But yeah, I think he was very conscious of the fact that religion and science were becoming more separate, and he didn't like to mix them necessarily. He kept those two spheres separate as until much later on in his life, probably when he was like, oh, he knows it all now, so he can start talking about it, and he doesn't care so much.
Well, I just simply add that, I mean, obviously you've spent your PhD was a painstaking process involving lots of archival work, but there was also cinchona trees in Kew. I mean, I have very fond memories of going to Kew and looking through Richard Spruce's notebooks, who was one of the cinchona hunters sent up by Markham to South America. And I mean, it was many, many years ago, right? It was very kind of you to make those comments in the book. I'm not sure it's actually available in any bookshops anymore because it was such a long time ago. But I do think it's a wonderful story, and I have vivid memories of visiting, an old cinchona stand beneath the volcano Chimborazo on the western slopes of the Ecuadorian Andes. And when you actually are in the environment, the natural environment, you are struck by what a unique environment it is, and you know, the ecology of that area, and why is it that cinchona trees that are high in quinine and other antimalarial alkaloids only grow in certain areas.
As does potatoes and cocaine, like 3 big plants from a very narrow slice of a mountain on the other side of the world has influenced Europe. It's just really fascinating, like you said, that particular area, that particular ecology, and why that has produced such significant plants.
Thank you, Mark and Kim. I think we've got time for one more question. Graham, would you like to speak?
Hi, Kim. Thanks very much for that talk. My ears pricked up when you mentioned the Plymouth Brethren, simply because I know that they seem to have been, to the best of my understanding, Julian Barker, who's here, might be able to be more precise than me, but a dominant influence within the National Institute of Medical Herbalists in certainly the 1970s and 1980s, if not in a decade or two before that. So in your research for your thesis, you know, did you come across any particular aspects about the Plymouth Brethren that might make them particularly inclined to want to promote plant medicines as being God's medicine? I would say that my own perception of that in the National Institute of Medical Herbalists in the 80s was that, as you say, they kept science and religion separate, but in the sense that science could only be science. You couldn't have a sort of metaphysical level, which of course pertains in Hippocratic Galenic medicine and in TCM or Ayurveda. You know, it was pure science and then pure religion, as it were.
I didn't know about that link. It'd be interesting to talk to you afterwards about that. I'll email you. No, because it wasn't my focus to really look at that aspect, and there have been, I was just trying to find it, of people, there have been a couple of books about the religion, particularly one by West. Yeah, there have been, I mean, I can't think of them off the top of my head. There have been a couple of theses about the religious side of them, but of course those theses don't necessarily touch upon the medicinal side. So at the moment we're very separate, so maybe someone needs to do the thesis of bringing them together. But yeah, I think just the idea that God gave, can't remember the quote, you know, plants as cures for mankind is very much linked up in that. But it doesn't mean plants, because the Howards and Sons factory were producing a lot of chemical medicines as well. It wasn't all plant-based. That's one thing I would say.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Fascinating question. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind, but it wasn't until the 1960s that, I mean, amazingly, but a plausible explanation came for the development of secondary plant compounds that we now understand. But they are, of course, defenses against predators. It took a very long time for the kind of world of ecology and pharmacognosy to get there. So it's really interesting discussions. I'm not going to draw it to an end too soon. We have another 5 minutes. And let's go to James Hamilton.
Yes, thank you, Graham, for that question.
James is still with us.
Yeah, sorry, classic. Forgot to mute my. Oh yeah, thanks. So I'll start again. Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. Really interesting. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the kind of colonial context of Howard and of the quinine industry at the time. Obviously, I guess there's an economic botany sort of element to that, but also you mentioned quinine as enabling the colonial intervention in Africa. I guess I'm particularly interested there in sort of who the quinine industry was dealing to and who it was for. I guess, you know, like most of the people exposed to quinine on a regular basis would be sort of rural workers and stuff like that. And was there at that time? Was there? I know there were later efforts, like in India in the 30s, there was a quinine program. I wonder if at the time there was any kind of effort from the quinine industry to reach those people, or if it was kind of a, you know, an elite sort of administrator, explorer, sort of that kind of thing.
No, there was quinine projects within India, British Indian projects run by the government to make sure that quinine got out to all sorts of areas. Of course, it was not always successful, because of the nature of its structure was biased. But there was a lot of talk about that, and I mean that's one of the things that Howard wanted, was like being able to cure everybody. But when you look at the sales of Howard's and Sons, I mean that wasn't them. I mean that was something that the government were working on. Howard himself and the Howard and Sons factory, if you look at their sales, I mean they're just selling a lot within Britain, they're selling a lot within Europe, and then they've got colonies and foreign sales. So it's not their particular interest, other than as suppliers, as just being chosen as suppliers, and that's where some of the tensions came about who would supply, because British India, they wanted to produce their own quinine internally to supply India itself. So
they're selling to people using it in Europe as a...
Howard is, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Plantations are tending to supply internally within India.
Yeah, and there's the whole story there that Kim talks about both in the thesis and the book, around quinine being marketed in Europe as kind of pure, and then the mixture of 4 alkaloids was marketed in India, where it was very well known from great clinical experiments in the 1870s to be really effective cure. And there are about 2 thick volumes on this attempt to get quinine powders into post offices, and as a very fascinating debate by current day scholars. I mean, essentially, at the time, it was recognized that even if, you know, but the production of cinchona in India would never be sufficient to get it down into every village. So that's, I think, the whole other PhD on humanitarianism and medicines in India, I think, waiting to be written.
Yeah, so I would add to that, like Lucy Veal worked on the Lucy Veal's did a thesis on Indian plantation project, and then Rohan Nebroy wrote a freely accessible book called Malarial Subjects. I've just dropped it in the chat, and those go really into this subject that you're asking about, James.
Amazing, thank you.
So a question from Tottenham, from Margaret Burr: has DNA analysis corroborated John Eliot Howard's concept of species and varieties?
No, sadly not. No, his varieties were really just varieties and not species. Or have they? Are you asking me, has a DNA analysis corroborated his varieties? I don't think DNA has looked at varieties, just species. And so his species assignments have not been corroborated. But pharmacists and pharmacognosis of the 19th century would probably debate that. So I think research is looking at varieties in chemistry. It's not something that tends to get looked at.
It's worth mentioning that there was a parallel PhD thesis doing DNA and chemical analyses on Howard's spark specimens, led by Ketia Peruvian student Natalie Canales. That study is producing really interesting work. Felix, no, hold on, Felix, wait. I forget your name of your hand up.
It's Michael de Sweet.
Michael, yes, Michael.
Yes. Kim, thank you so much for your talk, and thank you indeed for mentioning the College of Physicians Herbarium. What I wanted to ask you is, you have described how dominant Howard's factory was on a worldwide basis in the production of quinine. But quinine is of such huge economic importance, or was at the beginning of the last century. When do you think the rest of the world caught up?
Caught up with quinine?
Yes, caught up with being able to make this and market the stuff.
No, it's happening also in France, Germany, and the Netherlands as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
That really, I mean, it's just, I can't go into every single detail, but Britain weren't the most successful in the end. It was the Dutch in Dutch Indonesia
Indeed.
who really led global trade and made the first quinine cartel and really dominated the industry after this period from the 1880s onwards.
And that was what was such a problem in World War II, when the Dutch production was taken away from the Allies. But yes. I agree. I understand that's not the subject of your dissertation, but I enjoyed it.
Point. Yes, thank you. And I've read some of your papers on it as well. So thank you for coming, for sure. Yes, there are so many different parts. I could have done a whole 45-minute talk on each section. Very selective, but yeah. Ultimately, the Dutch were the ones that dominated. Howard and Sons no longer exist after the early 19th century.
And I think it's worth mentioning that we do go into that wider subject in Just a Tonic, a natural history of tonic water, available from all good bookshops and published by Q. And that does include quite a lot of quite cutting edge research. Anyhow, we are going to wrap up now with Felix and the last question.
Okay. I don't have a question actually, Mark. My hand isn't up.
Okay.
But I can say I can mightily recommend the thesis, which I think is online, isn't it, Kim? Is that right?
Yes.
All the way research.
Yeah. It is on there somewhere. I should drop it in the link, shouldn't I?
So thank you so much, Kim. Really, I must say, I never dreamt when you started that there's such a wealth of material. And there's a whole other talk and all the different archives that you ended up mining for this material, the chance discoveries at the bottom of red boxes and so on, and drawing it together and contextualizing it so well in terms of 19th century science and religion, as Howard would want us to remember. So I think you've done both kind of history of medicine and history of science, but I also hope John Eliot Howard's family and of course the descendants of John Eliot Howard are still very much in touch with each other via the regular newsletter, the budget as it's called. Really he's lucky to have had you as a researcher.
Yes, thank you very much to the family, because lots of people helped me out with hunting for archives and providing photos. And I think there's quite a few members of the family here tonight, so that's nice, because one day I'd like to organise a tour around the Howard sites in Tottenham and perhaps Kew. So if anybody's interested, please do email me. I'll put my email in the bottom there. If there are enough people, I will do a little tour. That's my email.
So we will be announcing soon next year's program, but at the moment our annual conference is fixed for April. British Society History of Pharmacy, it's a small society, punches above its weight, I think, in supporting its field. So do feel free to look at our website, and if you like, do join us. And we look forward very much to seeing you at future events. But again, thank you, Kim, and thank you to all the questioners as well. And thank you to all of you for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.